Hey, internet friends, or should I say, honk honk, internet friends. How's my small fringe minority doing? As we straddle the line between nightmare world and clown world, sometimes it's difficult to know where to focus. But today, in honor of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's invoking of the Emergency Act in response to incessant honking, today we're focusing on Canada. I'm going to give you an accelerated rundown of the great country of Canada, aka America's hat. Then we're gonna vroom vroom through this Canadian trucker convoy timeline, pump the brakes, then finish off with some final thoughts and considerations. So buckle up, everybody. Here's what the media won't tell you about Canada. Canada, the second largest country in the world where 90% of Canadians live less than 200 kilometers from the border with the United States. The country is spread out over 10 provinces and 3 territories. It's home to the longest coastline in the world. And the rest of uninhabited Canada is a vast expanse of wilderness. Despite the size of the country, it only has 0.5% of the world's population within its borders. British and French descendants making up about half the population, followed by European and Asian immigrants, with First Nations peoples making up about 4% of Canada's population. Canada is the world leader for uranium mining, and it is also one of the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes being an intelligence sharing arrangement between the 5 English-speaking democracies, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This whole thing evolved during the Cold War as a mechanism for monitoring and sharing classified intelligence. British monarch Queen Elizabeth II is technically the head of state in Canada. She's represented by a Governor-General, performing most of her constitutional and ceremonial duties while the Queen resides back in the UK because she's got 14 other Commonwealth realms to control. Quote, "It's said that all executive, legislative, and judicial power in and over Canada is vested in the monarch. The Governor-General is permitted to exercise most of this. In other words, the British monarchy lords over Canada, a crown colony. But just how much exactly? Some claim that the monarchy has very limited powers over Canada, and the vast majority of laws are made by Canada's elected federal government, its parliament and prime minister. Its current prime minister being Justin Trudeau. His daddy was a 4-term Canadian prime minister, even though there's all kinds of memes circulating that make it look like his daddy was actually prime minister of Cuba. Where's Maori when you need him, right? But nevertheless, despite the repeated incidents of blackface, Justin Trudeau has served as leader of the Liberal Party since 2013 and Prime Minister since 2015. When the news of the pandemic hit in March 2020, governments around the world closed their borders, shut down their economies, and encouraged citizens to, quote, "stay home and stay safe." Canada was no exception. They did the whole mask mandates, testing, and contract tracing thing. During the second and third waves, the premier of each province, the equivalent of a U.S. state governor, had, quote, "the power to issue broad directives on all issues, including business closures and stay-at-home orders for the entire population," end quote. Of course, these measures and directives were met with criticism of citizens saying that they were government overreach and that the government of Canada was implementing medical tyranny to further its hold and control over the population. And who was most affected by these lockdowns? As I've covered in many a video, the greatest exchange of wealth in modern history has taken place over the last 2 years, at the expense of the working class. On the 15th of January 2022, the Canadian government began enforcing vaccination requirements applying to truckers who entered Canada, meaning that unvaxxed American truckers have been denied entry to Canada since the 15th. Furthermore, those government requirements included Canadian truckers who were not fully vaccinated and said that those truckers have to show proof of a negative PCR test collected within 72 hours of arriving at the border. And those truckers also need to quarantine after arrival. In other words, US and Canadian truckers can't freely and conveniently cross the border without being vaxxed. And this is what originally sparked the protest. It was reported that because of these new vaccine requirements, up to 160,000 truck drivers between the US and Canada could be losing their ability to travel across the border, therefore losing their ability to effectively do their jobs and earn an income. The official name of the protest against these mandates became known as the Freedom Convoy, with convoy organizers saying that they came to the decision that the government crossed a line with the COVID-19 vaccine passports and vaccine mandates. A GoFundMe fundraiser was started for the Freedom Convoy in mid-January, and after surpassing $10 million in donations, it was suspended by GoFundMe. But that didn't stop the truckers because thousands of vehicles formed convoys across Canadian provinces before meeting up in Ottawa on the 29th of January, rallying at Parliament Hill. These vehicular convoys were joined by thousands of other protesters on foot, with initial police reports saying that there were over 3,000 trucks and up to 15,000 protesters. Since converging on the 29th, there have been other offshoot protests at other Canadian capitals. Media coverage descended upon the protesters, highlighting neo-Nazi behavior, images of Confederate flags and swastikas. But there was lots of talk that the media and government just planted those images and people within the protest so they could denounce them as hateful, bigoted, terrorists. You know, the government's usual MO for dealing with actual pushback. Just another slap in the face by the government-controlled media. In the United States, you remember when they called the burning down and looting of cities in summer of 2020 mostly peaceful? Fiery, but mostly peaceful. With this trucker convoy, there was no looting of shops and cities, no setting stuff on fire. There was just music, dancing, and lots of honking. 2 days after the initial big protest in Ottawa, Trudeau, a self-proclaimed vaxxed and masked fella, tested positive for COVID, thus prompting a quarantine period where he got to very conveniently go into hiding. No, literally, they went into hiding. The same day he and his family went into hiding, he delivered remarks about the convoy to the nation in a national address saying, "We are not intimidated," calling the protesters a fringe minority. On February 2nd, the Freedom Convoy organizers stated that they planned to remain in Ottawa until the mandates ended. That's when police held a press briefing the same day saying that the protesters were highly volatile and dangerous. In response, the following day, convoy organizers held a press conference where they decried being painted as racist, misogynist, and even terrorists. Then, on February the 4th, a $9.8 million class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of downtown Ottawa residents against the protesters over their incessant truck honking. On February the 5th, the protests reached Quebec City, Toronto, Vancouver, Halifax, and New Brunswick. Then, over the next few days, the Ottawa mayor declared a state of emergency, and Ottawa police began seizing fuel from protesters. And almost 2,000 more officers were called in after the government labeled the protests a siege. But the truckers and protesters wouldn't budge, and by golly, they kept on honking. On February the 11th, the Ontario government invoked a new emergency measure with a state of emergency aimed at protesters and ending the blockades at key border crossings in the province, including a maximum penalty of $100,000 and up to a year of imprisonment for non-compliance. On February the 13th, counter-protesters blocked convoy vehicles in Ottawa, which I found particularly interesting because these are pro-lockdown mandate protesters essentially marching for their own enslavement, but okay, go off. Then finally, we've reached Valentine's Day, February the 14th, which was just yesterday, when, for the first time in Canadian history, the federal government invoked the Emergencies Act, which gives the federal government sweeping new powers to restore order and bring the ongoing trucker convoy protests and blockades to an end. So the Canadian government announced that they will freeze the bank accounts of truckers who continue to form freedom convoys. Quote, they said, "We are today serving notice if your truck is being used in these illegal blockades, your corporate accounts will be frozen. The insurance on your vehicle will be suspended." So we're all caught up. I'm recording this on the 15th. This was by no means an exhaustive timeline of Freedom Convoy events, but I think we all get the picture. Governments around the world have used COVID as an excuse to implement medical tyranny and government overreach at the expense of the working class. And now that the working class has pushed back on these mandates, the government calls the fringe minority, quote unquote, fringe minority doing so, dangerous terrorists, Nazis, whatever word they can label these people, so they can go in and forcibly end the protests. What's interesting is we actually saw the same sort of government response when China was cracking down on protesters in Hong Kong, and you remember how every leader in the Western world condemned China's actions? You remember that? But now that those Western leaders are able to use the same methods to quell peaceful protests, we got a whole lot of nothing, just silence on the line.
He was asked which country he most admired and referred to China.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China, because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green as fast as we need to start investing in solar. I mean, there is a flexibility that I know Stephen Harper must dream about, of having a dictatorship that he could do everything he wanted, that I find quite interesting.
By the way, I am totally biased when I report all this information about truckers. Totally biased. It is no secret that I support truckers and anyone in their pursuit of freedom from a totalitarian government. But do I see how totalitarian governments will spin these protests as they're spreading to the United States, to Germany, to France, and even Israel? I can just see it now. I believe they will use the anti-vax truckers as an excuse to why there's so many food shortages as the year progresses. They'll blame them for the supply chain breakdowns. And we already know that the World Economic Forum's main objective is to usher in a one-world government. But they also want a global digital currency, data on every world citizen, global digital IDs, all of our private property ownership to be transferred to the government, and they want the total ability to restrict our movement, our spending, and our lives. So as I watch Trudeau, for example, seize the bank accounts of these truckers who just wanted bodily autonomy, essentially, so they can continue to make an income, I find the precedent that's being set by him to be very worrisome. I can't help but think that Trudeau is making an excellent lackey for the higher powers, the people above our World Economic Forum villains. My observation here is tolerance breeds more tolerance. The more government tyranny is tolerated, the more will be ushered in. What's playing out in Canada right now, the outcome will set the stage for the New World Order. And that's what the media won't tell you about Canada. So those are my final thoughts on the matter. What do you think, internet friends? You know I always look forward to your comments. Thank you so much for subscribing and supporting my channel on Patreon. Honk honk. Bye.